If 1962 had taken Pele's World Cup from him through injury, 1966 took something else from him entirely, a deeper kind of faith in the game's fairness. Brazil travelled to England as two-time defending champions, but the team that arrived bore little resemblance in its preparation and cohesion to the sides that had triumphed in 1958 and 1962. Many of the players who had carried Brazil to those earlier titles were now well past 30, their best years behind them, while the squad selection process back home had been chaotic enough that the final 22-man group was only confirmed weeks before the tournament began. Brazilian football administrators, confident in the momentum of two consecutive titles, had made surprisingly little accommodation for the fact that an entire generation of the country's finest players was simultaneously approaching the natural end of their competitive careers. Pele, by this point 25 years old, and at what should have been the peak of his footballing life, found himself the target of a level of physical punishment that went beyond anything he had experienced in his career to that point. Opposing defenders, unable to contain him through skill or positioning, resorted increasingly to a simpler method. They fouled him, repeatedly and violently, often with what appeared to be little concern for consequence, in an era when refereeing offered forwards nowhere near the protection later generations of players would come to expect. This particular tactic was not entirely new to 1966, but it reached a level of severity in England that shocked even seasoned observers of the international game. Coaches across Europe had, by the mid-1960s, begun studying Pele's game closely enough to conclude that conventional defending, relying on positioning and interception alone, simply could not contain him with any reliability. The alternative many settled on, however unofficially, was closer to attrition than tactics. Reduce his effectiveness by making every touch of the ball physically costly, regardless of whether the ball itself was ever actually won cleanly. It was a strategy built on the assumption that even the finest technical player in the world could be worn down eventually, if the punishment came fast and hard enough, and it very nearly worked exactly as intended. The wider footballing world eventually took note of what had happened to the game's finest player in England, and the tournament is frequently cited, in later histories of the sport, as one of the influences that pushed football's governing bodies towards stricter enforcement of foul play in the years that followed. Part of a slow but real evolution in how referees were instructed to protect skilled attacking players from exactly this kind of deliberate physical targeting. It would take years, and several more tournaments, before those changes meaningfully altered how the game was officiated. But 1966 stood, for a long time afterward, as a kind of cautionary example, cited by administrators and coaches alike whenever the conversation turned to how far organised violence could be allowed to substitute for genuine defending before it began to threaten the sport's own integrity. Brazil's opening match against Bulgaria offered an early warning of what the tournament would become. The squad that travelled to England lacked the settled cohesion of the two previous title-winning campaigns. Several key figures from 1958 and 1962 had aged out of top form. Replacements had been trialled and discarded right up until the final selection, and the coaching staff itself seemed uncertain, in a way that had not been true 4 years earlier in Chile, about exactly what kind of team they were trying to build. Pele scored a spectacular free kick in that match, curling the ball over a defensive wall with the kind of technique that had become his trademark. But he left the pitch that day, having absorbed a series of fouls that left him unable to train properly ahead of Brazil's second match against Hungary. Without their talisman fully fit, Brazil lost that match, their first World Cup defeat in 12 years, a result that sent a wave of unease through a country that had assumed, perhaps too comfortably, that another title was simply a matter of course. Hungary's victory was built on pace and movement that Brazil's ageing defence, missing the sharpness of earlier tournaments, struggled to contain, and pundits back home began, for the first time in over a decade, to ask uncomfortable questions about whether the golden generation that had carried Brazil to 2 consecutive titles had finally begun to decline. He returned for the decisive match against Portugal, still carrying the effects of the earlier punishment, and was subjected to some of the most brutal treatment of his entire career. Fouled repeatedly and with little apparent consequence from the match officials, eventually limping out of the tournament entirely as Portugal won and Brazil crashed out at the group stage. Television footage of the match, preserved and revisited many times in the decades since, shows a series of challenges that would almost certainly result in dismissals under the refereeing standards of later eras. Tackles that appeared aimed as much at the man as at the ball, with little visible intervention from an official clearly overwhelmed by the physical nature of the contest. Pele, hobbling increasingly badly as the match progressed, remained on the pitch far longer than his condition reasonably allowed. Substitutions in that era of the sport still being a relatively new and cautiously used tool, leaving him to absorb punishment that a modern medical staff would very likely have removed him from the field to avoid entirely. The team doctor travelling with Brazil's squad would later remark that more players were injured across those 8 days in England than in the previous 8 years combined. Pele himself, hacked down repeatedly by Bulgarian and then Portuguese defenders, was eventually forced out of the tournament through injury for the second World Cup running, managing only 2 matches before his body simply could not continue. Brazil, without their finest player fit to contribute and hampered by a squad that lacked the balance and freshness of earlier years, were eliminated in the group stage entirely, failing even to advance to the knockout rounds. For a nation that had come to expect the World Cup as something close to a birthright, it was received back home as a genuine national catastrophe. Pele's own account of that tournament, given years later, described it as the toughest experience of his footballing life, worse even than the injury in Chile, because this time the pain was accompanied by a deeper sense of injustice. He had missed part of 2 consecutive World Cups now, not through misfortune exactly, but through what felt, in the moment, like a targeted campaign of violence that officials had done almost nothing to prevent. He left England, by his own description, disillusioned and deeply depressed, and made a private vow that he would never again put himself through the experience of representing Brazil at a World Cup. He meant it sincerely enough that he held to this position for close to 4 years afterward, avoiding, in interviews given during this period, almost any discussion of a possible international return, a subject that clearly still carried real pain for him, even as his club career continued to flourish. Friends and teammates who spoke to him during these years described a man who had genuinely closed that particular door in his own mind, not out of anger at the game itself, which he still loved as completely as he ever had, but out of a very human unwillingness to place his body through that specific ordeal a third time. Whatever wounds the tournament left on him personally, they did not diminish his club form in the years that followed. Santos continued its remarkable run through the second half of the 1960s, adding further state and national titles to a collection that already read, by any measure, as one of the finest sustained periods of club dominance the sport had produced. The touring schedule continued as relentlessly as ever, crowds around the world still gathering whenever Santos's fixtures were announced, still hoping to see, even briefly, the player whose reputation had by now outgrown football itself. And Pele's goal tally, already extraordinary by any reasonable measure, continued climbing toward a number that had begun to take on an almost mythical significance in Brazilian football culture. As the count of his career goals across all levels of competition approached 1,000, the entire country began, in effect, to hold its breath. Brazilian football itself underwent a period of genuine soul-searching in the years immediately following the 1966 collapse, with administrators, journalists, and former players openly debating what had gone wrong and how a nation that had produced 2 consecutive World Cup titles could fall so far so quickly. Some of this reckoning proved constructive, leading eventually to more careful and methodical squad preparation ahead of the 1970 tournament. Some of it, inevitably, descended into the kind of finger-pointing and scapegoating that follows any national sporting failure, with various players, coaches, and administrators absorbing blame in the press that, viewed with the benefit of hindsight, seems to have been distributed rather unevenly. Pele himself largely avoided being cast as a central villain in this post-mortem, in part because so much of the tournament's failure had visibly been inflicted upon him rather than caused by him. But the broader disappointment of the era nonetheless left its mark on how Brazilian football approached the years that followed. He later admitted, with some amusement, that he had deliberately delayed the milestone once it came within reach, wanting the goal to arrive under circumstances worthy of the occasion, rather than in some minor friendly that history would barely record. In a hastily arranged exhibition match against Botafogo, roughly 2 weeks before the milestone, he scored twice, pushing his tally to 999. And then, in Santos's next official fixture against Bahia, he deliberately avoided shooting at goal entirely, worried that his own teammates, sensing the occasion, might simply let a shot through out of reverence rather than genuine defensive failure. He wanted the goal, when it came, to be earned on merit, in a match that counted, on a stage that mattered. The weight itself became something of a national event in miniature. Newspapers began running a running count in their sports sections in the days leading up to the Vasco da Gama fixture, and photographers and camera crews arrived at the Maracana hours before kickoff, uncertain exactly which match would finally produce the goal, but unwilling to risk missing it. Vendors outside the stadium reported selling out of Santos merchandise well before the gates opened, a crowd gathering less for an ordinary league fixture than for what everyone sensed might become one of the defining moments in the country's sporting history. Even opposing Vasco da Gama supporters, arriving to support their own club, found themselves swept up in an atmosphere that had very little to do with which side actually won the match. That stage arrived on the 19th of November 1969 at the Maracana Stadium in Rio de Janeiro in a match between Santos and Vasco da Gama. The choice of opponent was, in its own way, fitting. Vasco da Gama, the very club that had once hosted him on loan as a promising teenager years earlier, found itself on the receiving end of the goal that would define an entire career's statistical legacy. And yet, accounts from the Vasco side of that afternoon describe remarkably little bitterness among their own players and supporters, many of whom seemed to understand, even in the moment of conceding the goal, that they were witnessing something considerably larger than their own match result. The goal itself came from a penalty, awarded on a decision that Pele himself later joked, with the dry humour of an old man looking back, would almost certainly have been overturned had the video review technology of later decades existed at the time. He stepped up and converted it calmly, the ball evading the Vasco goalkeeper's outstretched hands, and the stadium simply erupted. What followed was less a football celebration than a spontaneous public event in its own right. Photographers and journalists, who had been positioned pitchside for days in anticipation of the moment, swarmed the field. Fans from both Santos and, remarkably, the rival club Vasco da Gama rose together to applaud him. Play was suspended for more than 30 minutes, while the crowd simply refused to let the moment pass quietly, and Pele was eventually carried around the historic stadium on the shoulders of his teammates, the goal itself called simply O Milésimo, the 1000th, entering Brazilian football history as one of its defining images. Newspapers the following morning ran the goal across their front pages, above whatever other news the day might otherwise have carried. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to describe the scene at the Maracana in detail, and in towns across Brazil, including in Bauru, where a barefoot boy had once played with a sock stuffed with rags, people gathered around whatever radios and television sets were available simply to hear the moment described. He was still only 29 years old, having reached the milestone in just his 909th professional match. The moment carried a weight in Brazil that went beyond sport entirely. He would later recall that in the days before the goal, he had encountered a group of children in Santos attempting to steal a car, and had stopped to talk them out of it. When asked afterward what message he hoped his 1000th goal might carry, he pointed back to that small, quiet encounter. Whatever else the number represented, statistically or symbolically, he wanted it to stand for something more useful than the number itself. Santos, in the years surrounding this milestone, would come to be remembered not only for the trophies the club won, but for that single afternoon at the Maracanã, when a stadium full of supporters from two rival clubs found themselves briefly united in appreciation of something that transcended which badge they had come to support. It was, in its own way, a preview of what would happen on an even larger scale less than a year later, when the entire world would watch him one final time on football's biggest stage, in a tournament he had once sworn he would never play in again. He had sworn in the depths of his disappointment after England that he would never play another World Cup. Vows made in moments of genuine anguish are not always vows that survive the passing of time, and as 1970 approached, and as Pele found himself at 29 playing some of the finest football of his career for Santos, the resolve he had carried out of that 1966 tournament began, quietly, to soften. He would say later that he changed his mind not for Brazil, not for the public expectation building around him again, but for himself. He wanted, after everything, one more chance to leave the World Cup on his own terms, rather than carried off it on a stretcher. The public campaign to persuade him back into the national side had, by 1969, become a significant story of its own in the Brazilian press, with journalists and former teammates alike making the case, in print and in person, that a squad this talented deserved the chance to be led by the finest player the country had ever produced. He resisted these appeals for some time, wary of reopening a wound that had taken years to properly close, before eventually allowing himself to be persuaded, quietly and gradually, that the team being assembled for Mexico was genuinely different from the disorganized side that had let him down 4 years earlier. Brazil's qualification campaign for the 1970 tournament, played across 1969, gave the country its first real look at the team that would eventually travel to Mexico, and the performances during this stretch did much to rebuild confidence that had been badly shaken 4 years earlier. Pele, restored to full fitness and playing some of the most consistent football of his career, scored freely throughout the qualifying rounds, and the sense began to build, gradually, that whatever had gone wrong in England had been corrected, both in terms of squad management and in terms of the underlying quality of the players available to represent the country. By the time the finals arrived, expectation in Brazil had shifted from the anxious uncertainty that had characterized the build-up to the previous tournament into something closer to genuine, settled confidence. Brazil arrived in Mexico for the 1970 tournament with a squad that history would eventually come to regard as one of the finest ever assembled by any nation in any era of the sport. Alongside Pele stood Jairzinho, a winger of ferocious pace and physical strength, Rivellino, whose left foot produced some of the most vicious set pieces the tournament had ever seen, the elegant, cerebral Tostão, the visionary midfielder Gerson, and, marshalling the defence from an attacking fullback's position, the captain Carlos Alberto. It was a team built not around caution, as Brazil's more chaotic 1966 squad had been, but around a shared, almost joyful conviction that attacking football, played at its highest possible level, would simply overwhelm whatever defensive systems the opposition attempted to construct against it. The conditions in Mexico presented a genuine physical challenge that had nothing to do with opposing defenders. With several matches played at high altitude and in considerable heat, testing squads accustomed to more temperate European and South American climates. Brazil's medical and conditioning staff had prepared specifically for these conditions in the months leading up to the tournament, a level of scientific attention to fitness that stood in deliberate contrast to the more haphazard preparations of 1966. It proved to be a wise investment. Several rival squads, less carefully prepared for the physical demands of the altitude, visibly wilted as their tournaments progressed, while Brazil's players appeared to grow only more comfortable and confident as the competition wore on. The manager entrusted with this vision, Mario Zagallo, had himself played in the 1958 and 1962 winning squads, giving him a rare, first-hand understanding of exactly what had made those earlier teams succeed and what had gone wrong 4 years later in England. He built his 1970 side around trust rather than rigid structure, allowing his most gifted attacking players the freedom to interchange positions fluidly, confident that a team containing this much individual quality needed a framework to support it rather than restrict it. It was, in its way, as significant a coaching decision as any tactical innovation the tournament produced. A manager willing to build his entire approach around getting the very best version of his best player onto the pitch, rather than trying to fit that player into a system designed with someone more ordinary in mind. The tournament unfolded, from Brazil's perspective, as something close to a footballing fairy tale. They won every single match they played across the entire competition, group stage through final, a feat matched by no other team in that era of the World Cup. Pele, restored to full fitness and freed, finally, from the punishing physical treatment that had defined his previous two tournaments, played with a freedom that captured the imagination of a global television audience larger than any World Cup had reached before it. This was the first World Cup broadcast in colour to much of the watching world, and the timing could not have suited its brightest star more perfectly. A generation of viewers who had only read about him or seen grainy black and white footage of his earlier tournaments now watched him in full colour, moving through defences with an ease that bordered on theatrical. The group stage draw had placed Brazil alongside England, the reigning champions, in what was immediately recognised as the tournament's most anticipated early fixture, a rematch of sorts between the two nations that had shared the sport's recent history most directly. England, managed by Alf Ramsey, approached the match with a defensive discipline that had served them well 4 years earlier on home soil, and the resulting contest, though Brazil ultimately won, was widely regarded afterward as among the finest and most tactically rich matches the tournament produced. Two fundamentally different footballing philosophies meeting at close to their respective peaks. There were moments across that tournament that have since become permanently woven into football's collective memory, independent of the final result. In the group stage against England, in a match widely regarded as one of the finest ever played at that stage of a World Cup, Pele rose to meet a cross from Jairzinho with a downward header struck with such power and precision that it appeared, for a fraction of a second, certain to cross the line. The England goalkeeper, Gordon Banks, somehow contorted himself across his own goal to claw the ball up and over the crossbar, a save so implausible that it has been argued about and replayed for more than half a century since, with Pele himself later admitting that his first instinct upon striking the ball had been to celebrate a goal he was certain he had already scored. Brazil won that match regardless, 1-0, through a Jairzinho goal, but it was Banks's save and Pele's header that provoked it, that the match is remembered for above the result itself. Against Czechoslovakia in the group stage, Pele attempted a shot from inside his own half, having noticed the goalkeeper stranded too far off his line, a moment of pure, almost mischievous audacity that narrowly missed the target, but that has been replayed and marvelled at for more than half a century since. A shot that succeeded only in failing to go in, and yet somehow remains more celebrated than most goals that did. Against Uruguay in the semi-final, in a rematch charged with the memory of Brazil's 1950 trauma against that same opponent, Pele produced a piece of skill that needed no goal to justify its place in football history. Receiving a ball played into space between two defenders, he allowed it to run past him on one side, while he ran around the other, wrong-footing both the ball's trajectory and the goalkeeper's expectations entirely, before shooting narrowly wide. Uruguay's defenders, and the goalkeeper himself, were left simply standing, having been beaten by a piece of movement that did not require the ball to actually be touched. Brazil won that semi-final 3-1, avenging, at last, the specific defeat that had haunted the nation for 20 years, and advanced to the final, having scored in every single match of the tournament, a run that included a remarkable feat from Jairzinho, who found the net in each of Brazil's 6 games across the competition, a record that stands alone in World Cup history to this day. The quarter-final against Peru, in the round preceding that semi-final, had itself been a showcase of pure attacking football rather than a tense defensive struggle, Brazil winning 4-2 in a match that felt, to many neutral observers, more like an exhibition of mutual attacking ambition than a knockout fixture where elimination hung on the result. Both sides seemed, at various points, more interested in outscoring the other than in shutting the game down, producing a spectacle that delighted crowds even as it occasionally alarmed both teams' own coaching staffs. The team's collective attacking output through the tournament had, by the time the final arrived, taken on an almost inevitable quality in the eyes of neutral observers. It was not simply that Brazil kept winning, it was the manner of the victories, fluid and inventive, in a way that made each match feel less like a contest to be survived and more like a performance to be enjoyed, regardless of which nation a given spectator happened to be supporting. The final, against Italy, on the 21st of June 1970, brought Brazil's campaign to its intended conclusion in front of a crowd of over 112,000 people inside the Azteca Stadium. Pele opened the scoring in the 18th minute, rising above Italy's defence to head home across from Rivellino, a goal celebrated with a leap into the arms of a teammate that would become one of the most reproduced photographs in the sport's history. Italy equalised before the break through a defensive mistake, and for a period the match hung in genuine uncertainty. But Brazil's superior quality asserted itself in the second half, with Gerson, Jairzinho, and finally, in the final minutes, Carlos Alberto adding further goals. That final goal, Brazil's 4th, remains among the most celebrated team goals in football history, a flowing move involving nearly every outfield player on the pitch, patient and unhurried, even as the match wound toward its conclusion. It began deep in Brazil's own half, the ball moving unhurriedly from defender to midfielder to forward and back again, more than a dozen touches passing between Brazilian players, while the Italian defence, exhausted and already beaten in spirit, if not yet on the scoreboard, simply chased shadows. The move culminated in Pele receiving the ball near the edge of the penalty area, laying it off with a single, perfectly weighted touch into the path of his captain, who arrived at full sprint to strike it first time into the corner of the net. Television commentators covering the match struggled to keep pace with the move as it developed, several accounts describing the goal, even in the moment of its unfolding, as feeling like something closer to a rehearsed piece of theatre than a spontaneous passage of competitive football. It is a goal that footballing purists still describe more than half a century later as close to the platonic ideal of what the sport, played with total freedom and total trust between teammates, is capable of producing. Brazil won 4-1. It was the nation's 3rd World Cup title, a feat that, under the tournament's rules at the time, entitled Brazil to permanent possession of the Jules Rimet trophy itself, retiring it from competition entirely. Pele, at the final whistle, was lifted onto the shoulders of ecstatic supporters who had stormed onto the pitch, his shirt eventually torn from his back by fans desperate for some physical piece of the occasion to keep. He had entered the tournament once as a reluctant, disillusioned veteran talked out of his own retirement. He left it as, by broad consensus, the finest player the sport had yet produced. His legend now secured not only by 3 World Cup medals that no other player has matched before or since, but by a tournament performance broadcast in colour to more households than any football match in history to that point. The scale of the global audience watching that final, larger than any World Cup had reached before it, meant that Pele's performance across the tournament reached households that had never had the opportunity to see him play at his best, in Sweden or Chile or England, when television infrastructure had been far more limited. For millions of viewers around the world, 1970 was simply the introduction, the first and lasting impression of what all the accumulated reputation of the previous 12 years had actually looked like in practice. It is a significant part of why, even now, the 1970 tournament remains so closely tied to his legend specifically, even though by most footballing judges, his very finest individual seasons had likely come years earlier, in the Santos shirt, in matches the wider world had simply never had the chance to see. Zagallo, for his part, entered a rarefied category of his own that afternoon, becoming the first man in the tournament's history to win a World Cup both as a player and as a head coach, a distinction that would not be matched by another individual for decades afterward. His calm, trusting management of a squad brimming with attacking talent stood in deliberate contrast to the more anxious, improvised preparations that had undone Brazil 4 years earlier, and football historians have, in the decades since, pointed to his specific approach to that 1970 squad as a template that later generations of coaches, managing sides built around 1 or 2 truly exceptional individual talents, would study and attempt to replicate. It would be his final World Cup. He was 29 years old, and though club football and one final adventure across an ocean still lay ahead of him, the international stage that had first introduced him to the world as a 17-year-old in Sweden had now delivered its final, and in many ways most complete, chapter. The boy who had promised his weeping father 20 years earlier that he would win Brazil a World Cup had done so a 3rd time, on the largest stage the sport had ever offered, closing a circle that had begun in a small house in Bauru with a radio broadcast and a promise made by a child who had no way of knowing yet just how thoroughly he would keep it. Life outside the World Cup continued to move at its own pace, and for Pele, the years following Mexico brought a gradual transition from the purely athletic concerns of his 20s into a quieter, more settled chapter of adulthood. In February of 1966, some years earlier, he had married Rosemary dos Reis Cholby, a woman he had met away from the noise of stadiums, and the couple would go on to have children together, a family life that existed, as much as it could for a man of his fame, somewhat apart from the version of him the public saw on match days. Rosemary herself had grown up in Santos, familiar with the club and its culture long before she ever met the young man who would become its most celebrated player, though those close to the couple described their relationship as developing away from football almost entirely, built on the more ordinary foundations of shared conversation and time spent together rather than any connection to his public life. Their wedding, when it came, drew enormous public attention regardless, a reminder that even the most private decisions in Pele's life had, by this point in his career, become matters of national interest, whether he wished them to be or not. His younger brother, Zoka, had by this point followed a similar path into professional football, also signing for Santos and playing alongside Pele for a period, though never approaching anything like the same level of individual success. It was, in its way, a small mirror of the two brothers' own childhood in Bauru. One sibling possessed of a talent that seemed to arrive without explanation. The other, a capable, hard-working player, content to build a modest career in his brother's considerable shadow. Zoka rarely spoke publicly in later years of any resentment about this comparison, describing instead a genuine pride in what his older brother had achieved, tempered by the ordinary, complicated feelings that come with growing up alongside someone the entire world had decided was extraordinary. The couple settled, as much as their circumstances allowed, into an ordinary domestic rhythm, raising children in a household that tried, where possible, to keep some distance from the constant public attention that followed the husband and father at its centre. Those closest to the family would later describe a man who, away from stadiums, preferred simple pleasures. Time with his children, music, the company of old friends from his earliest days in football who had known him before any of the fame had arrived. It was a version of himself that very few members of the public ever had the chance to see directly, existing almost entirely behind the version the cameras and the crowds had come to expect. Fame of the kind Pele carried by his late 20s was not something that simply switched off between matches. He could not walk through most cities in the world by this point without being recognised, and Brazil, in particular, had come to regard him as a national institution rather than an individual private citizen. There is a particular kind of loneliness that can exist inside extraordinary public adoration, a sense of being endlessly seen and yet, in some ways, never quite known. Pele rarely spoke about this burden directly during his playing years, preferring instead to let his performances speak for him. But those close to him described a man who treasured, more than most might expect, the ordinary and private moments his career afforded him less and less of as the years went on. His children, growing up in this period, would later describe a father who did his best to shield them from the more overwhelming aspects of his celebrity, insisting on ordinary routines at home, even when the world outside the front door made such ordinariness increasingly difficult to sustain. Family meals, school events, quiet evenings that had nothing to do with football at all. These were the moments Pele is remembered by those closest to him as guarding most carefully, aware that his own childhood, however materially difficult, had at least afforded him the anonymity to simply be a boy among other boys on the streets of Bauru. His own children would never have that particular freedom, a trade he had made, however unwittingly, the moment his own extraordinary talent had first announced itself on that dusty ground so many years before. On the pitch, his relationship with Santos, the club that had rejected him once and then never let him go for 18 years, continued to define the rhythm of his professional life. He remained the club's central figure well into his 30s, still capable, even as his explosive pace of the 1960s gradually gave way to a more measured, more experienced style of play, of moments that reminded crowds exactly why they had filled stadiums to watch him for nearly 2 decades. Where the younger version of him had relied heavily on speed and improvisation, the older Pele compensated with something perhaps even more difficult to defend against: an almost complete understanding of the game itself, an ability to read a match several passes ahead of everyone else on the pitch, positioning himself not where the danger currently was, but where it was about to be. The goals slowed, as they inevitably do for any player entering the later stages of a career, but they did not stop entirely, and Santos continued to benefit from having, even in his final domestic seasons, a player whose mere presence in the squad remained one of the most valuable assets in world football, capable of selling out stadiums on reputation alone, even on nights when his body could no longer quite do what it had done a decade earlier. Younger teammates who joined Santos during this final stretch of his career often described the particular privilege of training and playing alongside a man whose earlier exploits they had grown up hearing about, sometimes from parents who had themselves stood in crowds watching the Santastics tour the world a decade earlier. He took an active interest in mentoring these younger players, several of whom would go on to have significant careers of their own, offering the same kind of patient attention that Valdemar de Brito had once shown him, understanding, perhaps better than most veterans in his position, exactly how much a young player's confidence could be shaped by an older teammate willing to take the time. Knees and ankles that had absorbed thousands of matches worth of tackles, many of them delivered by defenders with far less regard for a forward's physical safety than later eras of the sport would come to require, ached in ways that no amount of experience could fully compensate for. He trained around these limitations as best he could, adjusting his game gradually to protect a body that had given the sport more than perhaps any single body reasonably could. But the difference between the electric teenager of 1958 and the wiser, more careful veteran of the early 1970s was, to anyone who had watched him across the full span of those years, unmistakable. By 1974, at 33 years old, Pele made the decision that had, in truth, been approaching for some time. He announced his retirement from Santos, bringing to a close an association between player and club that had begun with a rejected trial and a homesick 15-year-old, and had grown over 18 extraordinary years into one of the most successful and enduring partnerships in the history of club football. Across those 18 years, by most careful counts, he had scored well over 600 goals in club competition for Santos alone, a figure that, combined with his international tally and the various exhibition and touring matches that made up so much of his career, contributed to a career goal total that Pele himself would later claim, with characteristic precision, at 1,283, though the exact figure has been debated by statisticians and historians ever since, given the sheer number of informal and exhibition matches involved in reaching it. His final full season with the club had itself included another state championship victory, ensuring that his Santos career would end not in a slow, quiet decline, but with one more piece of silverware added to a collection that already defied easy summary. It mattered to him, by his own later account, that the ending felt earned rather than simply endured, a final campaign in which he had still contributed meaningfully to the team's success, rather than serving out his final months as a diminished figure carried by younger teammates. Whatever the accumulated toll of nearly 2 decades of professional football had taken on his body, his footballing mind, by every account from those who played alongside him in that final season, remained as sharp and as generous as it had ever been. The farewell was not, in the end, a single tidy occasion. Santos organised testimonial and tribute matches in the period surrounding his departure, opportunities for supporters who had grown up watching him, some of them now bringing their own children to see him one final time, to say goodbye properly. One such match, played at Villa Belmiro against a selection of international stars assembled specifically for the occasion, drew a capacity crowd that spent as much of the evening applauding between passages of play as it did watching the actual football, a tribute less to any particular moment in the match than to the accumulated weight of nearly 2 decades of afternoons and evenings this same stadium had spent watching him. Older supporters in attendance that night had first seen him play as a homesick 15-year-old in 1956. They now watched him leave, at 33, a 3-time World Cup winner whose name had become, by that point, essentially synonymous with the sport itself across large parts of the globe. There is a particular feeling that comes with watching a genuinely great athlete near the end of their career, a mixture of gratitude and quiet sadness that has very little to do with the final scoreline of any individual match, and everything to do with the recognition that something extraordinary, something that will not be seen again in quite the same form, is drawing to its natural close. He had, by this point, achieved essentially everything the sport had to offer a player of his generation. 3 World Cups, countless domestic and continental titles with Santos, a career goal-scoring record that no player before him, and arguably none since, has matched with anything approaching the same combination of volume and occasion. He was, by any reasonable assessment, entitled to walk away from football entirely and let the achievements simply stand on their own. Individual recognition had accumulated alongside the team's success throughout these years as well. Honours that, taken together, illustrated just how completely he had come to be regarded as the finest player of his generation, and arguably of any generation. He had been named South American Footballer of the Year on multiple occasions during his Santos career, and various publications and football associations around the world had, by the time of his retirement, already begun compiling the kind of retrospective lists and tributes typically reserved for players whose careers were long finished, a testament to how settled the consensus around his greatness had become, even while he was still actively playing. For a period after his formal retirement, it seemed as though that was exactly what he intended to do. He spoke, in interviews given in the months following his departure from Santos, about wanting to spend more time with his family, about business interests he hoped to develop away from the demands of professional sport, about a chapter of life that, for the first time since he was 15 years old, would not be organised primarily around a training schedule and a fixture list. It is worth remembering that he had been a professional footballer for essentially his entire adult life to that point, having signed his first contract as a boy still years away from full maturity. Retirement, for a person in that position, was not simply the end of a job. It was the end of the only structure his life had ever really known. The business ventures he pursued in this period met with uneven results. Some endorsement and commercial relationships built on his name proved durable and lucrative. Others, entered into with less scrutiny than his footballing decisions had ever received, would go on to create financial complications that followed him into later decades, a reminder that the instincts which had made him unmatched on a football pitch did not automatically transfer to boardrooms and contract negotiations. He was, by his own later admission, more comfortable trusting his feet than his business partners in these years, a vulnerability that a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated on the pitch and then vindicated by his own performance had perhaps not fully anticipated finding in an entirely different arena. But retirement, for a man whose entire identity had been shaped by the sport since he was a barefoot child kicking a sock stuffed with rags through the dusty streets of Bauru, did not sit entirely comfortably. Brazilian football had given him everything, and he had, in turn, given nearly 2 decades of his adult life almost entirely back to it. A fair exchange by most reasonable measures, but one that had left very little space to discover who he might be day to day, without a training schedule organising the hours ahead of him. An ocean away, in a country where the sport he had spent his life mastering remained a curiosity rather than a passion, an unusual opportunity was beginning to take shape, one that would ask him, at 34 years old, to do something he had never attempted before. Not to win another trophy, exactly, but to introduce an entire nation to a game it had never properly learned to love. In 1975, a year after his retirement from Santos, Pele agreed to something that surprised much of the football world. He signed with the New York Cosmos, a club playing in the North American Soccer League, a competition that existed at the time on the distant periphery of the sport's global consciousness. Association football in the United States of the mid-1970s remained a game most Americans associated, if they thought of it at all, with school playgrounds rather than professional stadiums. Baseball diamonds and gridiron fields dominated the country's sporting imagination entirely. He had, by his own later account, weighed the decision carefully before accepting, aware that joining a league so far outside the sport's established centres of prestige carried real risk to a reputation he had spent 2 decades building. Friends and advisors in Brazil offered mixed counsel, some viewing the move as a curious final chapter, unworthy of a 3-time World Cup winner, others recognizing, more presciently, that a player of his stature had the rare opportunity to shape an entire nation's relationship with the sport, rather than simply adding one more accolade to an already complete resume. It was this second consideration, more than the financial terms alone, that appears to have tipped his decision in the end. The contract that brought him to New York was reported at the time to be worth around $7 million over 3 years, an extraordinary sum for the era, financed by Warner Communications executive Stephen Ross, who understood that acquiring the most famous athlete on the planet might do more to establish soccer in America than any amount of conventional marketing ever could. Ross was, in the end, entirely correct. Pele's arrival transformed the Cosmos almost overnight from a modest, struggling franchise into one of the most talked-about sports stories in the country. Crowds that had numbered in the low thousands began arriving in the tens of thousands, filling first Downing Stadium and eventually the much larger Giants Stadium, simply for the chance to watch him play, often for the first and only time in their lives, in person. American sports writers covering his debut appearances struggled in places to explain to their own readers exactly what they were witnessing, describing a level of skill that seemed to belong to an entirely different sport than the disorganized amateur soccer most American audiences had any prior experience of. Journalists who had spent their careers covering baseball and gridiron football found themselves almost accidentally filing some of the most enthusiastic sports writing of their careers about a game their own newspapers rarely covered in any depth. Crowds who arrived skeptical, drawn mostly by curiosity about a famous name, often left having witnessed something that reshaped, at least for one evening, their entire understanding of what the sport could look like. He was joined over the following seasons by other significant international talents, including the West German defender Franz Beckenbauer, one of the finest players of his own generation, and the prolific Italian striker Giorgio Chinaglia. Together, this assembled group of veterans and rising talents turned the Cosmos into a genuine footballing force within the league, and in 1977, Pele's final season with the club, they won the Soccer Bowl, the league's championship, giving him one more piece of team silverware to close out an already unmatched collection. The championship run that year captured a level of mainstream American sports media attention that the league had never previously managed, with newspapers that had spent years relegating soccer coverage to a handful of paragraphs at the back of their sports sections, now running features and photographs on their front pages, chronicling a story that felt, to many editors, less like a niche sporting interest and more like a genuine cultural moment unfolding in real time. Attendance across the league as a whole climbed steadily through these years, other clubs benefiting from the general surge of interest that Pele's arrival, more than any single marketing campaign the league itself had attempted, had generated almost single-handedly. What Pele achieved with the Cosmos was, in some ways, more significant than the trophy itself. Where once there had been only baseball diamonds and football gridirons in much of the American sporting landscape, soccer pitches and soccer crowds began appearing in numbers the country had never seen before. Youth participation in the sport surged during these years, laying groundwork that would, across the following decades, eventually contribute to the United States' emergence as a genuine footballing nation in its own right, hosting a World Cup of its own in 1994, and building, slowly, the domestic professional infrastructure that would eventually become Major League Soccer. None of that arrived quickly, and none of it was solely Pele's doing, but few individual athletes, in any sport, have been credited so directly with helping to plant the earliest seeds of a nation's relationship with a game. Beyond his performances on the pitch, Pele made a point during these American years of participating directly in youth clinics and coaching demonstrations across the country, appearing at schools and local club programs in cities the Cosmos had no fixture scheduled in at all, simply because the invitation had been extended and he judged the visit worthwhile. Coaches and administrators involved in the early development of organised youth soccer in the United States would, in later decades, frequently trace a portion of their own program's founding energy back to some version of these visits, a single afternoon with a genuine legend proving enough, in more than a few documented cases, to convince a sceptical local school board or parks department that the sport was worth investing real resources into. His final professional match came on the 1st of October 1977 at Giants Stadium, in an exhibition arranged specifically for the occasion, pitting the Cosmos against his old club Santos, in a fixture designed so that he could play one half for each side, closing his career, symbolically, wearing the shirts of both clubs that had defined it. The stadium was filled to capacity. Among those present to honour him was the boxer Muhammad Ali, another athlete whose fame had long ago outgrown the boundaries of his own sport. The two men embracing on the pitch in a photograph that has been reproduced countless times since. Two of the 20th century's most recognisable faces sharing a single frame. He walked off the field for the final time as a professional footballer that afternoon, the crowd rising to acknowledge a career that had begun, more than 2 decades earlier, with a rejected 15-year-old and a coach willing to vouch for a talent no one else had yet recognised. It was, in every meaningful sense, an ending. It was also, in ways Pele himself likely could not have fully anticipated in the moment, closer to a beginning of an entirely different kind of public life. Rain fell intermittently through parts of that October afternoon at Giants Stadium, a detail several attendees recalled fondly in later years, joking that even the New Jersey weather seemed to understand the occasion called for something more atmospheric than ordinary sunshine. The crowd, drawn from across the New York area and beyond, included fans who had followed his entire career from Brazil, immigrants and expatriates for whom his brief American chapter had briefly brought a piece of home considerably closer, standing alongside a much larger number of curious Americans experiencing, for many of them, their first live exposure to the sport at anything resembling this level. The decades that followed his retirement from playing saw Pele transition into a role that few former athletes in any sport have managed with quite the same global reach. He became a goodwill ambassador for football and for humanitarian causes more broadly, travelling extensively on behalf of organisations including the United Nations, using the enormous weight of his name to draw attention to issues of poverty and childhood welfare that echoed, in some ways, the circumstances of his own beginning in Bauru. His humanitarian work in these years took him to countries facing famine, conflict and poverty far more severe than anything he had known even in his own difficult childhood, and those who travelled with him during these visits often remarked on how naturally he seemed to connect with children in these communities, crouching down to their level, kicking a ball around in dirt yards not unlike the ones he had once played in himself, a gesture that required no translation and carried, for many of the children involved, a significance that went well beyond the simple fact of a famous man's visit. Between 1995 and 1998, he served formally within the Brazilian government itself, appointed as the country's first extraordinary minister for sport, a position created specifically to make use of the credibility and public trust he had spent a lifetime earning. In that role, he pushed for legislative reforms aimed at improving transparency and player welfare within Brazilian football's often chaotic administrative structures, an effort that met with mixed success, but that reflected a genuine desire on his part to leave the sport that had given him everything in a somewhat healthier institutional state than he had found it. The reforms he championed, which came to be informally known by his own name in Brazilian legislative circles, sought to give players greater freedom of contract and to impose stricter financial oversight on club administrations that had, for decades, operated with very little outside scrutiny. Some of these measures passed into law in modified form. Others met resistance from entrenched interests within Brazilian football, who saw a former player, however legendary, as an outsider, attempting to reshape a system that had operated, however imperfectly, on its own terms for the better part of a century. He would later describe this period of his life as, in some ways, more frustrating than anything he had encountered on a football pitch, where at least the rules of engagement, however physically demanding, had always been clear. He remained connected to the sport in less formal capacities as well throughout these decades, appearing as an honorary presence at major tournaments, lending his name to youth development programs across South America and beyond, and serving, in the eyes of successive generations of players, as something close to a living embodiment of the sport's own history, a figure whose approval or blessing carried weight that no official title could fully capture. His personal life in these later decades continued to evolve. His first marriage to Rose Mary ended in the late 1970s, a separation that played out, as so much of his life did, under a level of public scrutiny that few couples navigating the end of a marriage ever have to contend with. He married again in 1994 to a psychologist named Asiria Lemos Seixas, a marriage that also eventually ended in divorce, and that produced, among other things, a period of Pele's life spent more quietly out of the spotlight than his playing years had ever allowed. In 2016, he married for a third time to Marcia Aoki, a relationship that would remain with him for the rest of his life, and that those close to the couple described as bringing him a settled contentment in his final years that had, at times, seemed to elude him during the more turbulent periods of his earlier adulthood. Across these years and marriages, he raised a family that would eventually include 7 children in total, among them his son Edinho, who would go on to have his own career connected to football, and whose closeness to his father would become especially visible in the final, difficult chapter still to come. Recognition, both formal and informal, continued to accumulate around him through these decades. In 2000, football's international governing body named him, alongside Argentina's Diego Maradona, as one of the 2 players of the century, an honour that, however debates about the relative merits of the 2 men continued among fans for years afterward, confirmed something that had been broadly understood since at least 1970, that Pele belonged, by any reasonable measure, among the very small handful of individuals who could genuinely be discussed as the finest player the sport had ever produced. He received honorary knighthoods and countless other national honours from governments around the world over these years, tributes that, taken individually, might have seemed like the ordinary accumulation any legendary athlete collects late in life, but that, taken together, illustrated just how thoroughly his name had transcended the sport that had made it in the first place. The debate over exactly how to rank him against later generations of players, particularly once Diego Maradona and eventually Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo began compiling their own extraordinary bodies of work, would occupy football conversations for decades, conducted in bars and living rooms, and eventually across the endless forums of the internet age. Pele himself tended to engage with these debates good-naturedly rather than defensively, aware that comparisons across eras of a sport that had changed so fundamentally in its tactics, its physical demands, and its global reach could never be entirely fair to any generation being measured against another. What set his case apart from most of these later comparisons, even his most ardent critics tended to concede, was the specific combination of achievement he alone had managed. 3 World Cup titles, won across 3 different decades, a feat that no amount of individual brilliance from later players had yet come close to replicating. He remained, well into old age, one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet, a status built not merely on statistics, extraordinary as they were, but on the particular, almost impossible to replicate quality that had first announced itself on a rutted street in Bauru decades earlier. A joy in the game itself, visible in nearly every match he ever played, that seemed to communicate something to crowds who did not speak his language and had never set foot in Brazil. football, in his hands and feet, had always looked less like labour and more like a kind of celebration. It was, perhaps, the quality that made his eventual decline, when it came, feel so difficult for so much of the world to fully absorb. Age, which had been kept at bay for so long by the sheer force of his early achievements, eventually caught up with Pele, the way it catches up with everyone, though the world, for a long time, seemed reluctant to accept it. He remained a public figure well into his 70s and 80s, appearing at World Cups as an honoured guest, lending his name and presence to ceremonies and tributes across a sport that continued to regard him as its founding elder statesman, the living proof of what the game, at its highest and most joyful, was capable of becoming. He had, across these later decades, watched the sport he had helped define transform almost beyond recognition from the one he had played in. Transfer fees had grown to figures that would have seemed like typographical errors to a young man earning $60 a month at Santos in 1956. Television and eventually digital broadcasting had turned football into a genuinely global, round-the-clock spectacle in a way that even his own extraordinary touring years with Santos had only gestured toward. He watched these changes largely with warmth rather than resentment, expressing admiration for successive generations of players, even as some of his own records, once considered permanent fixtures of the sport's history, began, one by one, to face genuine challenges from younger men playing a version of the game his own career had helped make possible. He had remained visible enough, even into his 80s, that his gradual physical decline played out to some degree in public view, a fact that made the final chapter of his life feel, to millions of people who had grown up watching him, unusually personal. Photographs from his final World Cup appearances as an honoured guest showed a man increasingly reliant on a wheelchair, his once effortless mobility gradually taken from him by age and accumulating health problems, though his presence at these tournaments continued to draw the same warmth and reverence from players and crowds alike that it always had. Younger footballers who had only ever known him as a legend rather than a contemporary, treating an audience with him as close to a pilgrimage. At the 2014 World Cup, hosted in his own country, he had been expected to attend the opening ceremony, but was ultimately hospitalised instead, a disappointment that many Brazilians felt keenly, given how completely his own history was intertwined with the nation's relationship to the tournament itself. He did appear at subsequent gatherings and ceremonies in the years that followed, each appearance greeted by crowds and cameras with an intensity that had not diminished in the slightest since his playing days, a reminder that certain forms of stardom, once earned as thoroughly as his had been, do not fade with age the way ordinary fame typically does. Health difficulties, however, gradually asserted themselves in his final years. In 2021, doctors discovered and removed a tumour from his colon, beginning a course of treatment that would define the remainder of his life. He continued to make public appearances where his health allowed, but the cancer, doctors would later confirm, continued to advance despite treatment, eventually complicating his kidney and heart function as his body struggled under the combined weight of the disease and the interventions meant to hold it back. Throughout much of 2022, his family and close friends made a point of visiting regularly, aware, in the way families often quietly come to understand these things before it is ever said aloud, that the time remaining was growing shorter. He was able, for periods during that year, to watch football on television from his hospital room, including matches from the World Cup held that winter in Qatar, a tournament he followed with evident pleasure, even as his own physical condition continued to decline. Reports from those close to him during this period described a man who remained, even in illness, fundamentally himself, curious about the game, warm toward the people around him, and largely without complaint about circumstances that would have given almost anyone reason for despair. He was hospitalized in November of 2022, and as the weeks passed, it became clear to those closest to him that his condition was not going to improve. His family gathered around him in the hospital in Sao Paulo in his final days, a period his son Edinho described publicly through social media, sharing a message that read simply, "Father, my strength is yours." Videos shared by the family in this period showed a man drifting in and out of consciousness, surrounded by people who loved him, in a hospital bed a very long way in every sense from the dusty streets of Bauru, where his story had begun 82 years earlier. Pele died on the 29th of December 2022 at the Sao Paulo hospital where he had spent his final weeks, following complications from colon cancer and the multiple organ failure that ultimately followed. He was 82 years old. The response in Brazil and around the entire footballing world arrived within hours and did not meaningfully slow for days afterward. Tributes came from across every generation of the sport he had helped define. Governments around the world issued formal statements of condolence. Stadiums observed moments of silence before matches that had nothing to do with Brazil or with any club he had ever played for. A recognition that his death was being felt as something closer to a global sporting event than the passing of any single nation's hero. Newspapers in countries where football itself remained a secondary sporting interest still carried the news prominently, an acknowledgement that, whatever else he had been, Pele's fame had genuinely reached corners of the world that most athletes in any sport never managed to touch. Neymar, the Brazilian forward who had, only weeks earlier, matched Pele's long-standing national scoring record during the 2022 World Cup, wrote that before Pele, football had simply been a sport, and that Pele had turned it into art, into entertainment, giving voice, in Neymar's words, to the poor, to black Brazilians, and to a country that football had helped make visible to the rest of the world. Tributes arrived as well from Kylian Mbappe, from Lionel Messi, and from countless other players and institutions who had never shared a pitch with him, but who understood, without needing to be told, exactly what had been lost. FIFA's president, Gianni Infantino, attended the wake held in Pele's honour and described him as a global icon of the sport, announcing that the organisation would ask every member nation to consider naming a stadium in his memory, a tribute intended to match, in its scale, the size of what Pele had meant to the game across every continent it was played on. The wake itself was held at Vila Belmiro, the modest stadium in Santos that had been his footballing home for 18 years of his career, the same ground where a rejected 15-year-old had first been given the chance no one else had offered him. His casket was placed at the centre of the pitch itself, allowing mourners to file past along the very turf where so many of his earliest professional performances had unfolded, a detail that struck many of those present as an unusually fitting final gesture from a club and a city that had shaped him as much as he had shaped them. The queue to enter the stadium stretched for hours at its peak, extending well beyond the surrounding streets, with people travelling from across Brazil and, in a smaller but still significant number, from abroad, simply to spend a few brief moments paying their respects. Thousands of mourners passed through to pay their respects, many of them carrying flags and jerseys bearing his name and the number 10 that he had made, more than any single player in football's history, synonymous with genius itself. In Tres Corações, the small town of his birth, mourners gathered as well, waving flags bearing his image, a reminder that the story had, in its own quiet way, come full circle, back to the place where it had all begun, with a name chosen after an American inventor, and a hope that the boy might illuminate something. The funeral procession itself moved slowly through the streets of Santos, the hearse making a deliberate, symbolic route past Villa Belmiro before continuing on toward the cemetery, allowing the city that had claimed him as its own for the better part of 2 decades one final, unhurried farewell. Residents lined the streets in numbers that recalled, in scale if not in circumstance, the celebrations that had once greeted him returning home from World Cups. His body was laid to rest at the Memorial Necropole Ecumenica in Santos, a vertical cemetery overlooking the city and the stadium where he had built the foundation of his legend, a resting place chosen, fittingly, within sight of the ground where the story of Pele, the footballer, had truly begun. In the years since, institutions across Brazil and beyond have worked to formalise his memory in ways that go beyond the statues and stadium namings that followed immediately after his death. A museum dedicated to his life and career operates in Santos, drawing visitors from around the world eager to see, in physical form, some trace of a career that so much of the planet had only ever experienced through grainy footage, photographs, and stories passed down from parents and grandparents who had been fortunate enough to watch him play in person. Schools, streets, and sporting facilities across dozens of countries now carry some version of his name, a testament to a reach that few footballers, and arguably few athletes of any kind, have ever achieved. Children born decades after his final professional match continue to learn his name, often before they fully understand the details of what he actually accomplished, absorbing it simply as one of those foundational facts about the sport itself. The way one might learn that football has 11 players on a side, or that a match lasts 90 minutes. He had, by the sheer scale and duration of his career, become something closer to a permanent fixture of the game's own vocabulary, a name that will very likely outlast every specific memory of the goals and matches that first earned it. The statistics that accompanied his death, repeated in obituary after obituary around the world, remained as difficult to fully absorb as they had always been. A world record by most counts of around 1,281 goals across more than 1,300 professional appearances. 3 World Cup winners' medals, a feat no other player in the sport's history has matched. 77 goals in 92 appearances for Brazil, a national scoring record that stood for decades before Neymar finally drew level with it, weeks before Pele's own death, in what felt, to many watching, like a strange and poignant closing of one particular circle, even as so many others remained permanently open. Statisticians and football historians have, in the years since his death, continued to debate the precise accuracy of some of these figures, particularly the total goal count, which includes a very large number of exhibition and friendly matches played across Santos's extensive touring schedule. Fixtures that were not always recorded with the rigour that later generations of football administration would bring to the sport. Pele himself was aware of this ongoing debate throughout his life and generally treated it with a kind of amused patience, more interested by most accounts in the matches themselves and the people who had watched them than in whatever exact number history eventually settled on. What is not disputed by even his most careful statistical critics is the sheer scale and consistency of what he achieved across more than 2 decades of professional football, a body of work that remains, by any reasonable measure, without a genuine peer in the sport's history. But the numbers, however extraordinary, were never really the whole of what people mourned in the final days of 2022. What Brazil and the wider footballing world lost was a living connection to the idea that the sport, at its very best, could be a form of joy rather than mere competition. That a barefoot boy playing with a sock stuffed with rags on the dusty streets of a small interior town could, through talent and persistence and no small amount of good fortune, become one of the most beloved human beings the modern world has known. He had once told his father, as a child listening to a radio broadcast of a lost final, that he would win Brazil a World Cup. He won 3. And somewhere along the way, in stadiums across every continent, in Sweden and Chile, in England and Mexico, in Lisbon and Lagos and East Rutherford, New Jersey, he had done something that outlasted even those extraordinary trophies. He had shown an entire world, watching for the very first time in some cases in flickering black and white and later in full colour, exactly what the game could look like when played by someone who never seemed to have forgotten why children first fall in love with a ball at their feet in the first place. For the boy shining shoes outside a cinema in Bauru, none of it would have seemed remotely plausible had someone described it to him in advance. Not the World Cups, not the crowds in Lagos and Lisbon, not a stadium in New Jersey filled to capacity for the sight of him one final time. Not a state funeral procession moving slowly past the ground where it had all truly begun. He had simply wanted, as far as anyone could tell in those earliest years, to play, to feel a ball at his feet on whatever patch of dirt or grass was available for as long as the light allowed. Everything else, the fame, the wealth, the 3 golden trophies, the number 10 sewn onto shirts in every corner of the globe, arrived as a consequence of that single, uncomplicated devotion, sustained without interruption across more than 2 decades of professional football, and, in truth, for the whole of a long life that never fully stopped being shaped by it. The rain falls now the way it fell over Bauru all those decades ago, over Sweden in 1958, over the Maracana the night of the 1000th goal, over Mexico City in 1970, and over Giants Stadium in 1977. Ordinary weather, falling over ordinary ground, that happened across the span of one long and extraordinary life, to carry the footsteps of a boy who became, by the truest consensus the sport has ever reached, the king.